eager to welcome you tonight to the Gerald Ford Presidential Museum. This is our last program of 2022, and what a year it has been, and what a way to go out, too. Yes. So I'd like to take a moment to thank each of you for your commitment to the Library Museum as we've navigated to this back to a more normal routine. And looking ahead in January, the museum's going to be opening a new temporary exhibit on guitars. So it's called America at the Crossroads. And we are already in the process of planning some great events that will supplement that exhibition. So watch your email and our mailboxes for more information on those events. Now I'd like to invite Gleaves Whitney, Executive Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, to the podium to introduce tonight's speaker. Please.
As Joel just said, we're back. Look at this. This is great to have all these people in the auditorium after all those months of COVID. So I applaud you for being here. You came for a great program this evening. As you all know, we've been bringing Bill Brands back to Grand Rapids, West Michigan, for many years, almost 2 decades. And I'll introduce him in just a minute. But first, I want to welcome our C-SPAN, our viewing audience. I want to welcome all of you who are here in person. I think we have some trustees from the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation to recognize. I think I see Bob Hooker, and I think J.C. Heising is here. We have one of the President Ford's family members, Greg Ford, a nephew of President and Mrs. Ford. Welcome. Always glad you're here. So, yep, go ahead and applaud. Absolutely. Now, those of you who have been to this gig before know that I have tried every which way possible, humanly possible, to introduce Bill in a new way. So one year, in fact, we used his haiku poetry. Remember that year? Haiku poetry to introduce him, because he's the author of a lot of haiku poetry that ended up in a book. Another year, we looked at, this was rich. We looked at his student evaluations. And I had never managed, in the 2 decades I've known Bill, to embarrass him in a good-natured way until I read the last student evaluation from a young woman who said, and you know the best thing besides the great storytelling? He's hot. So I've run out of ideas for introducing him. So here's what I'd like to do. You all know Bill. You've been coming back. 90% of this audience. How many of you have heard Bill in person? Yeah. So I'm going to ask you the questions. Where does H.W. Brands teach? University of Texas, Austin. How many books has he written? 1 million. I think that's low. How often does he write a book? Every year. Sometimes, in fact, he'll get off the airplane and say, how's your book going? You mean books? Sometimes he publishes 2 books in a year. It's really amazing. He'll be working on a biography in one hand and then the economic history of the United States on the other. Really amazingly prolific. So, okay, how many of his published books have been Pulitzer Prize finalists? Now we're getting tough here. Yeah. Oh, Lou Paletta's done her homework. Is it 2? 2. 2 of them have been Pulitzer Prize finalists. That's right. So, you know, we've got in Bill Brands a delightful person to address us. And one of the reasons I always enjoy having Bill back is that he's one of the few academic historians who also bridges the gap to the reading public. And, you know, it takes place in so many of the History Channel and other documentaries where you see him and his expertise, and it's really a lot of fun to follow Bill's career that way. He always has something very interesting to say, and that's the other reason we always have him back. He can make you look at a subject you thought you knew and see it in a new light. So, because he's so good at that, rather than my talking any further, let me ask you, are you ready to learn tonight? Yes. Huh? Ready to learn? Yes. Bill Brands, come on up.
Thank you, Gleaves, for that kind introduction. Thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be back in Grand Rapids, to be back at the Ford Museum. I'm here because Gleaves asked me to come, and the reason he asked me to come is that he wants me to write a book on the 1970s. He didn't put it quite so bluntly when we had the conversation that led to this invitation back in September. But he pointed out to me that we are approaching the 50th anniversary of the several events that placed Gerald Ford at the center of national and international attention. And he wanted somebody to sort of frame the period. So what is the America that Gerald Ford stepped onto center stage of? And I had actually, I don't know if I told you this, but I have been thinking about the 1970s for a while. Specifically, I've been thinking about the 1970s since the 1970s. Now, lately I've been writing books about people long dead. So I wrote, my most recent book is about William Sherman and Geronimo and that generation of people who fought the last phase of the Indian Wars of the West. The book before that was about folks who lived and fought during the American Revolution. So when you deal with history that's that deep in the past, then we all look on it essentially from the same perspective, from long past the time it happened. But if we talk about the 1970s, then we're talking about something that I lived through. Please raise your hand if you have a fairly active memory of the 1970s. Okay, yeah. Before this, I should say I had lunch with a friend who is a judge in Austin. And one of the things that he was saying is, I wrote a book a few years ago about Douglas MacArthur and Harry Truman. And this gentleman, who's a little bit older than I am, said that was one of his earliest memories in sort of being aware of the world. He remembered when Truman fired MacArthur. So, obviously, the farther back we go, the fewer people there are who remember this stuff. But the reason I'm saying this is that I'm going to use this as a way to kind of frame my approach to this maybe book that I might write. But I will say that Gleaves is a very effective spokesman for his causes. And he might very well talk me into writing this book. But you're going to be a test audience to see sort of how you like the idea. But also, and I'm going to speak for maybe half an hour or so, and then I want to engage you in a conversation because I'm, by the hands that you raised just a moment ago, I'm talking to people who lived through the 1970s. And there's part of me that is the author who writes books that I want people to read and buy, that I want to know what would get you to buy a book on the 1970s. First question for all of you. Would you be more inclined or less inclined to buy a book about a period that you lived through? So raise your hand if more inclined, other things being equal. Okay, I think so. I mean, I can understand this. There are people who like their literature, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, to be sort of exotic, to take them to a place they never were, never would go otherwise. It's kind of, I consider this sort of the travelogue approach to history. So we read about some period that's very different from the present time, and that's the appeal for some of us, some of the time, maybe for other people all of the time. But there definitely is, I mean, and the hands raised the second time indicate, that there's this interest in this time that I lived through. So, I'm older than some of you and younger than some of you, but I'm going to tell you that this period, it's now basically 50 years ago today, roughly, is a period when I was in college. The first presidential election that I voted in was the 1972 election. And I was just 19 at the time of the election. And this was the first presidential election where people under the age of 21 could vote. And I was, for the first time, becoming pretty interested in public affairs. Now, some of this reflected the fact that when I was in high school, I had an American history teacher that really engaged my interest in political history. And so the kind of history you see unfolding before our eyes is most evidently political history, because if you pick up a newspaper, we find out what the president is doing, what Congress has done, what's happening in foreign policy. So this is political stuff. And I was paying attention to it in part because I had this teacher that I thought who made it come alive, in large part because this teacher focused on individuals, not events, but people. And what were people doing, and what were they thinking, and what made their world go round. And perhaps, well, maybe because I was influenced by that teacher, or maybe I was drawn to that teacher's approach because I had a pre-existing inclination in this direction, I find that when I try to write history, I always end up writing biographies. Some of my books are actually biographies. It's the life and times of Andrew Jackson or Ronald Reagan. But even when I write about other subjects, even when I write about a period or a subject, it always hinges on these individuals. Because that's the way I just tend to interpret history, and that's what draws me to history. And I think it's one of the reasons that biography as a genre is more popular than history as a genre. Some of you will remember your history class from high school with something less than excitement. History classes in high school have a bad reputation, and I speak as somebody who used to teach history in high school. I still teach history in college. And perhaps I've used this line in this auditorium, and perhaps some of you will remember it, although one of the groups that I speak to, the University of Texas, where I teach, has a very active continuing education program. And this for retired folks who now have time on their hands and want to come and just hear something about history. And I preface something that I was going to say by, I don't remember if I told this group this story before, and a gentleman in the back, and I said this probably, I don't know, 20 years ago, and this gentleman in the back was probably 75, and I was 20 years younger than I am then. And he stood up and he said, "Sonny, if you don't remember, we sure as hell don't remember." So anyway, so the story is this about people's recollection of their history class, their high school history classes. And this is true, I know, in Texas, where I've been living for the last 40 years. Perhaps true in Michigan as well. That a lot of people cannot remember the last name of their high school history teacher. But they do remember that the first name was Coach. And it reflects the fact that there are a lot of non-specialists teaching high school history. But anyway, so I had a special interest in paying attention to public affairs, especially American politics and American foreign policy, being in college in the early 1970s. First of all, is there anybody in the room who was in the same situation? And preferably, to answer this question, if you were male. Then, anybody in college in the early 70s? Okay, what was on your male mind, except the obvious things, when you were in college in the early 1970s? And why were you paying attention, for example, to who was going to win the presidential election in 1972? What was hanging over your head, my head? The war in Vietnam and the draft. And so I knew that if the war in Vietnam was still on when I graduated from college, or, heaven forbid, the college deferment for the draft should be ended, then I might be off to Vietnam. I've reflected on this to my students. During their lifetime, my students now were born about the time the United States invaded Afghanistan in 2001. Between then and the time the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. And I point out to them that it's striking to me that neither one of those wars, in Afghanistan or Iraq, was particularly popular in the United States, but there was almost nothing in the way of protest. And I asked them to reflect, why do you suppose that was? Do you know the answer? No draft. None of them had any skin in the game. And so it didn't matter, but it did matter when I was in college. And in fact, they did end the student deferment while I was in college. And those of you who were in college and male at the time may remember, do you remember lottery day? When they drew and they figured out, okay, are you going to get drafted or not? And do you remember, at least on the campus where I was, you could hear the reactions from the open windows of the dorm rooms around, where there would be an, oh no, or yeah, depending on what number was drawn when your birthday came up. Anyway, so I'm drawn to this period, and I remember much of it, but I've studied it a little bit because I've written sort of around it and through it when I wrote a book about Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was active in politics in the 1970s, so I covered some of that ground. But to look at it specifically and to figure out what was really going on. And I have never actually centered a story about that period on Gerald Ford. Now I'm going to explain why, if somebody were to write a book on American politics and foreign policy in the 1970s, it might be a smart idea to center it on Gerald Ford, because he is right in the middle of some really momentous stuff. And maybe if I do decide to write this book, maybe Ford will play a central role. But at the moment, here's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking that, well, I was telling Gleaves this earlier, the title I have in mind is The Great Unraveling. And I can tell you that a little bit at the time, but certainly as a historian looking backwards, I see the 1970s as a period, and I don't want to get too specific within the 1970s, although the title for the talk tonight was Watergate, right? When the 70s really began. I am going to talk about Watergate because it's right in the middle of this story. But the 70s, in some ways it began, well, historians sometimes argue about, was the 1970s more important than the 1960s or something. There's a silly argument because events don't pay any attention to the calendar. They just happen, and just wherever they happen to fall. But what did happen in the 1970s as a whole served as a time when an attitude toward politics and government unraveled. And I put it this way. In 1970, if you had come of political age in 1970, oh, that's me. When I was 17 years old in 1970, and then 18 and so on, I knew enough about the history of American politics during the previous half century or so, to realize that starting in the 1930s, there had been a shift in American attitudes, in attitudes of American voters regarding what they expected from government. In the 18th century, in the 19th century, people expected almost nothing of government. You looked to yourself, and you hoped the government would stay out of the way as much as possible, but everybody was a believer in small government back in the 18th and 19th century. Now, the modern Republican Party, when it was founded in the 1850s, it was the first political party devoted to bigger government. It might be worth a reminder that the modern Republicans, they were the ones who wanted bigger government because they wanted government to assist business in the development of the American economy. But the idea that government, for example, should help out people when they lost a job, when they became sick, when they were impoverished for whatever reason. No, that just wasn't what government did. People would look to private charities. They would look to members of their family. They would pray. But don't look to government. Government's not in that business. Grover Cleveland famously said when he vetoed a law that was going to provide aid to Texas farmers, he said that I have always thought that the people should support government, not that the government should support the people. But during the 1930s, this changed because the Depression hit so many people and hit them in ways that made them realize, I didn't do anything wrong. I did everything right. And still the economy collapsed on me, and I have to deal with the consequences of this. So there was this change in American attitudes. And Franklin Roosevelt ran on the platform in 1932, was reelected overwhelmingly in 1936 on the idea that government should help folks out when they need help. The centerpiece of this was the Social Security Act of 1935. And that set in motion this idea that government should get more involved and government should help solve the problems that American society faces. And this, at the time, was characterized as the essence of American liberalism. You were a liberal in those days if you looked to government to help solve society's problems. You were a conservative if you said, no, leave those problems, leave the fixing to the private sector. And there were strong, good arguments on both sides of the issue, but the liberal side, the bigger government side, was winning the argument. And it won the argument through the 1930s. It won the argument in the sense that it won the elections. And government got bigger, and each time government got bigger, then people started expecting this new thing that government did. Before Social Security was created in the 1930s, nobody expected it. But once people started getting Social Security paychecks, then there was no way you could take it away. Until the 1960s, nobody expected government to be in the healthcare business, but along comes Medicare, and now you couldn't take Medicare away. George W. Bush tried. He thought that maybe we'll privatize part of Medicare, and it didn't go anywhere. So there was this tendency for somebody like me in the 1960s, so I was vaguely aware of elections in the 1960s, but in the early 1970s to think this is a permanent trend in American life. And people will just expect more of government. The conservatives didn't go away. The smaller government people, they didn't vanish. But in American politics, if you get 55% of any vote, that's a big win. And you take it and you legislate on that basis. But then things changed. And so in 1970, this more government is better attitude was still pervasive in American politics. Jump ahead to 1980. Ronald Reagan is elected on a small government platform. Ronald Reagan, in his first inaugural address, says, government is not the solution to our problems. That's what the liberals think. Government is the problem itself. And so something happened in the 1970s to change this view. And so the unraveling I'm talking about is the unraveling of this consensus that government is your friend. Government can solve America's problems, or at least make a good try at solving them. But there are other aspects of an unraveling. In 1970, the United States was clearly the most powerful country in the world. And pretty much anything that the United States put its mind to doing, it could do. The United States could land a man on the moon, 1969, just according to JFK's schedule, right on schedule. The United States was involved in combating communism around the world, and it had held the line since 1945 mostly against communist advance. And the United States was engaged in a war in Southeast Asia. As late as 1970, it was quite feasible to believe you could still do it. But of course, the Vietnam War ends badly for the United States. The U.S. loses its first war. And so in 1980, Americans realized we can't do everything. Furthermore, the economic miracle that was the American economy starting in the early 1940s with spending on World War II that created the modern American middle class and that made Americans wealthier and better educated and better housed and better everything. Through the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, it looked like that was going to go on. But then in the 1980s, things begin to fall apart. And the first thing that happens is the United States goes off the international gold standard. The United States had been the prop of the world financial system, and it can no longer carry that up. So Richard Nixon in 1971 says, okay, we're no longer going to make our dollars convertible to gold. And then inflation sets in. And the gold part of it, that seems symbolic to most people because most people didn't care whether the U.S. redeemed foreign dollars in gold or not. But when inflation set in and became the chronic behavior of the American economy during the 1970s, then Americans began to think, wait a minute, this idea that each generation is going to be wealthier than the generation before, this crumbles as well. So all of this stuff is going on, and then And then there's another aspect of it that had been appreciated in prospect by such astute political philosophers as Lyndon Johnson. Some of you will remember that in American politics during most of the 20th century, there was this phenomenon called the Solid South. And do you know which party the South was solid for? The Democratic Party. And when Lyndon Johnson, on behalf of the National Democratic Party, Lyndon Johnson, by the way, a Southerner himself, although half a Westerner being a Texan, when he put his signature to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, he's turned to his secretary, Bill Moyers, and said, "Bill, I think we've lost the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come." So this was beginning to happen about 1970, but in the 1970s, but continuing into the 80s, 90s, this great migration of Southerners out of the Democratic Party into the Republican Party was underway. And what this did, it didn't simply rebalance politics. It made politics much more bitter, much more partisan than they had been before. Because until the 1960s, American party politics had always been a mishmash of political philosophies. There were Republicans and there were Democrats. Before that, there were Democrats and Whigs. Before that, there were Federalists and Republicans. But in every occasion, in every decade before the 1960s, each of the two political parties often shared some philosophical outlook with the other party. So, to take the most recent and continuing party system, the modern Republicans and the Democrats. In the 1960s, there were conservative Republicans, the Goldwater Republicans. And there were liberal Republicans, the Rockefeller Republicans. There were liberal Democrats, there were the McGovern Democrats, and there were conservative Democrats, most Southern Democrats. And so, under those circumstances, success in politics required and permitted a bipartisan approach. So, for example, when Lyndon Johnson lobbied Congress for civil rights legislation, he got a higher percentage of Republican votes for civil rights reform than he got of Democratic votes, because most of those Southern Democrats voted against the Civil Rights Act. But the consequence of this was that when laws passed, they had a kind of credibility that comes only from the fingerprints of both parties on the bill. What happened in the course of the 30 years after Lyndon Johnson told Bill Moyers, "I think we've lost the Republican Party, we've lost this out to the Republicans," was the two parties sifted out. By 1990, there were first of all, there were relatively few Southern Democrats. The South went Republican. And which meant that all those Southern conservatives who had been Democrats, they become Republicans. And they make the Republican Party more conservative. Because with all those Southern conservatives pouring into the party, there's no room left for the Northeastern liberal Republicans. So the Republican Party becomes essentially 100% conservative. And the Democratic Party becomes 100% liberal or progressive, take your pick. So here I need two hands for this. In the 1960s, you could get, on any important issue, you could get the Republicans over here from your side, so this is the Republican Party, the right hand, and you get the Democrats over here. And there was enough overlap between the two that you could find that middle ground support. But from 1960s to the 1990s, the two parties pulled apart. So that by the 1990s, essentially, every Republican is more conservative than every Democrat. And the two parties then fell under the tyranny of the primary system. Primaries were less a big deal back in the days when there was this middle ground. Sure, in primaries, you would run and try to get your party support, but as soon as you got the party nomination, you would hew to the middle. And then you'd usually be met there by the other nominee coming from the other direction. But now politics does not consist in reaching out to the middle. It consists in mobilizing your base. And the way you mobilize your base is you get more extreme as the general election comes along. So this stuff was happening in the 1970s. And the biggest part of this, was the loss of faith in government. And the loss of faith in government, what underpinned the idea that government is part of the solution, the government is the solution or could be a part of the solution, is a confidence when the government does stuff, it gets it right. And if you were of that generation, if I had been born 20 years earlier, 30 years earlier, if I'd been old enough to know the Great Depression, then if I had been unfortunate enough, for example, to lose my job in the Great Depression and discover that Social Security will provide unemployment compensation for me, if I had lost money when the banks failed and now knew that there was something called FDIC, which guaranteed my deposits in banks, then I would think, yeah, that's a government that I like, and that's something that worked. And then comes World War II, and the American government has never been more successful in any big undertaking than in saving democracy in World War II. Taking on fascism in 3.5 years, destroying fascism, and making the world safe for democracy, and in the process making the United States the most powerful and the richest country that has ever existed on the face of the earth. Government really got stuff right. And this persisted through the 1950s and into the 1960s. By the end of the 1960s, government was sort of coasting on the credibility that it had gotten up till then. But still, it was quite possible. This was very common, and I do remember probably saying this myself. I do remember hearing this from adults at the time. If you don't know whether the government's doing something right or not, well, you should probably have confidence that they are, because that's, government does. And they know more about this stuff than we do. If you knew as much as the president knows about this, that, or the other thing, you'd probably take the same policy. And so there were a lot of policy actions that didn't actually incur really close scrutiny, because the idea was that, okay, these are good people, and they're doing their best, and they know more about this stuff than I do. So we'll defer to them. Well, then along comes Watergate. You knew I was going to get there. Along comes Watergate, and along comes Vietnam. And these two issues deal a body blow to this idea that ordinary people should have confidence in, should have faith in government to do the right thing or to be able to accomplish what it sets its mind to. In the case of Vietnam, it was a combination, because Vietnam was, the end in Vietnam was preceded by, how many of you remember reading the Pentagon Papers, or parts of them, or are aware that the Pentagon Papers were published? And the Pentagon Papers were a secret Pentagon history of the war in Vietnam, which demonstrated that at times when government officials were saying in public, we're going to win the war, we see the light at the end of the tunnel, privately they were telling each other, oh boy, this is a really bad situation. We don't think we can come out of this. So when the Pentagon Papers were published, then it became apparent that there was serious misleading by government about this war. And this is one of the things that really turned Americans against the war. That, first of all, it lasted a long time. Long wars are not popular, especially when young men are going to have to go off and fight them against their will. The draft is going to be on. And then Vietnam ends in a defeat. So not only was government deceptive and therefore unethical and not worthy of confidence, but it was also inept. Even when it was doing the wrong thing, it didn't accomplish it. So Vietnam is a large part of the story. behind the loss of confidence in government. And this is crucial to the story of the 1970s. And if I do write this book, this is really what this great unraveling is all about. But the other part of the story, the domestic part of the story, is Watergate. So now I'm going to share with you a teaching technique, a pedagogical device that I use with my students. In part because it takes me back to when I was their age. My students get younger and younger every year. But I will tell you that the reason that I still teach is that the first day of the fall semester to me is the best day of the year. Because I get this new crop of students. I teach mostly, by numbers, I teach mostly freshmen. And they come in. I teach a class that starts on Monday morning, so I'm very often the first college class they've ever had. And we talk about it a little bit. And I observe, and they agree, for the great majority of them, this is the first time they've ever lived away from home. The first time they've ever had an opportunity, the first time they've ever been encouraged to figure out what they think and not just, do what their parents thought or inherit what their parents thought. And they get to decide, well, who am I? And what do I believe and what are my values? And another thing, for somebody who has been studying American history and American politics for a long time now, it's pretty easy for me to get kind of jaded and know that we've got these problems that are just intractable. And they're never going to go away. But I don't tell that to my students. They'll get jaded soon enough. No. But because when they come into my class, maybe you can remember, some of you maybe are not much older than 18, but when you're 18, first of all, you're entering this new world. And there are all these possibilities before you. And they come in and they're as idealistic as can be. And whatever cause they're engaged in, we're going to solve that problem. And more power to them. And it does keep me from just receding into the shell where we're never going to fix this stuff. So I really appreciate this from my students. But anyway, so back in the 1970s, so the exercise that I give my students that takes me back to when I was their age, when I teach the second half of my U.S. history survey, the first half goes from colonial times to the Civil War. The second half goes from the Civil War to the present. So nominally, we try to get to 2022. But it does mean that this exercise I'm about to describe actually works, and it fits in the chronology of the course. For the last essay, the last written assignment the students have, I require them to read the newspaper from their hometown for the week in which they were born. So go back 18, 19, 20 years and read a week's worth of newspapers and find out what was going on in the world. I do this because I want to, part of it is I want them to learn to appreciate their parents. When you were 18, I think 18 is perhaps the nadir of appreciation for parents. When you're 8, you think that your parents are great. By the time you're 38 and you have kids of your own, then you realize, okay, all right. But when you're 18, your parents don't know anything. And so this isn't really the main reason for this exercise, but it is, I think, a positive side effect because they will learn what their parents were dealing with. And it's not just what their parents have told when I was your age, etc. Oh, this stuff actually happened. Another thing is I tell my students all the time that if they don't like the world that they are inheriting because they're just entering adulthood, nowadays in most states the legal age is 18, so they're about to vote in their first election and do whatever you do as an adult. And so I say, if you don't like the world that you are inheriting, blame me. And I would say if you were there, I'd say blame them too. Blame the older generation because we created this world we're about to hand off to you. But one day, believe it or not, dear students, statistically speaking, the great majority of you are going to be as old as I am now. And if you don't like the world then, it's on you. because you had your chance. So pay attention to what has gone before. So I asked them to do this, and most of them really like it because, so that's what was happening. And my parents told me about that, but it really did happen, and so on. But there's another reason that I asked them to do it, and it is to give them perspective on history and how we know what we know. And this isn't just history. When you deal with anybody and anybody tells you something, is that person believable? Is that thing they told me, is it credible? We always weigh evidence. I mean, some people we trust more or less implicitly. Other people we distrust all the time. And for most things that we consume, information we consume, is somewhere between the two. So I asked them to do two things. I asked them to identify something that seemed important at the time, but turned out not to be important. And what's the measure of this? If it was reported on, let's say consistently through the week, but has never shown up in any history book, including their textbook, that they read now. That 20 years after the fact, roughly, it's simply not important. And you probably won't be surprised to know that that accounts for about 90% of what you read in newspapers. Most news is out of date within 3 or 4 days, let alone 2 decades. So the easy part of the exercise is to discover that the Miss America pageant changed its rules in 2003 or something like that. And at this point, nobody cares. The other part of the exercise flips it around and say, find something that is going to become important enough to make it into the history books, and you've got some history books to consult, but is not reported on during the week you're reading, but was going on during the week you're reading about. So something was happening or had happened, but was not thought to be important at the time, but with perspective and distance came to seem important. And do you know the example that for a long time I have trotted out to my students? The thing that was not reported on, but turned out to be earth-shattering, or at least, what shall I say, presidency-destroying? Watergate. Because when Watergate first started, the whole point was it was to be a secret. It was not to be reported on. And the members of the President Nixon's re-election campaign, they did their best to keep it quiet. But the roots of Watergate actually go far back beyond, at least a few years back, beyond the moment in June 1972 when those 5 burglars were arrested at the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. And the line that was conveyed by the President Nixon's PR people was that this was, as his public relations spokesman said, it was a third-rate burglary that had nothing to do with the presidency. And so we'll just ignore it. Now, it was a third-rate burglary, to be sure. And one of the curious storylines of Watergate was not only was the cover-up and all the other stuff unethical, it was illegal and dishonest, but it was also inept. If the burglars had been any good, they never would have been arrested. But here's where I like to make sure that students don't think that things that happen in history, storylines in history, are simple or uncomplicated. If there's one mission I have in life for my students, it's to complicate their understanding. It's to complicate your understanding of what you think about history. Because a lot of people are willing to believe that of people they know, of things that happen today, well, sure, it's complex, and there's this, that, and all the other stuff. But for some reason, when they look back in the past, they want things to be cut and dried. And so this is a good person, that's a bad person. This is a hero, this is a villain. But no, that's just not the way it works. So Richard Nixon had reasonable, I would say ethical, maybe even honorable motives in putting in train the events that would lead to that burglary and Watergate. I referred earlier to the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers were this massive breach of American security because the papers were all classified, secret, top secret. They were not supposed to be let out. And thousands of pages came out. Who did this? How could this be done? As a recent example, about, 6 months ago now, there was a draft of a Supreme Court opinion in the case that overturned Roe v. Wade that was leaked. And as far as I know, as far as anybody's reported, the leaker has not been identified. Come on, how hard can it be? There aren't that many people who had access to it, but anyway. So Nixon is really concerned that the American national security apparatus, the people who work in the Pentagon and in the intelligence services and in the FBI, they have decided to take policy into their own hands. And of course, the point of leaking the Pentagon Papers is to make it more difficult for the government of the United States to prosecute the war in Vietnam. Now, that part itself complicated Nixon's own job because he was trying to wind down the war in Vietnam, but there's all this other stuff that he has to deal with. But the bigger issue was Nixon was in the process of formulating what would come to be called his opening to China. After 20 plus years of treating the government of the People's Republic of China, Communist China, as a fiction, and the only genuine government of China, the government on Taiwan, Nixon was going to normalize relations between the United States and China. And as a person who had been most vehement in opposing any such thing before he became president, he knew he was going to have to do this in utter secrecy because if the word got out early, then the enemies, the opponents of this strategy, would be able to push it aside and make it impossible for him to do. And the Chinese government wouldn't have gone along with it at all if it already had become this hot issue because it was controversial for them too. So Nixon engages this group that came to be called the Plumbers because they stopped leaks. And they wanted to find out how Daniel Ellsberg, who was the principal leaker of the Pentagon Papers, how he got access to this stuff and why he did what he did. And this led to some crossing of the lines of individuals' privacy. So Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office was burgled to find out if Ellsberg was revealing any deep secrets to his psychiatrist. And that was illegal. It was unethical. And I don't say this by any means to try to exonerate Nixon, but the American government had been in worse stuff than this before that. If that's all it had been, then that would have been a comparatively venial sin. But it got beyond that because once you've got this organization, some of you perhaps will have had this experience, or at least observed it, that once you hire people to do something, you got to find something for them to do. And you can't apply an Uber approach. You can't just hire as gig workers people who are going to invade other people's offices. And if they're on the payroll, they're on the payroll. And so to go from this approach toward policy toward China, and by the way, and this was going to lead to a new opening called détente toward the Soviet Union, and here's the big deal, it was going to lead, in Nixon's view, and it actually did happen, led to the first important arms control agreement between the nuclear superpowers. So there is a perfectly worthy end in sight here. But once you've got them, they're going to do other stuff. So there was no thinking that Lawrence O'Brien's office in the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in the Watergate had anything to do with arms control policy. But, and this is where my interest in history as biography kicks in. And it applies to Nixon, and it also applies, refreshingly, in the opposite way to Gerald Ford. Because Nixon clearly was going to win the election of 1972. There was no question about it. First of all, he had won with a comfortable margin in 68. It wasn't a runaway by any means, but the Democrats, as a result of the debacle in Chicago surrounding the National Convention, they recast the rules for nominations that set in motion the nomination of a very decent fellow, a senator from South Dakota, named George McGovern, a very decent fellow, who is probably the worst candidate in American history for the last 60 or 70 years. And if you want to know why many people in the country think that the Democrats can be counted on to act as though they know better than the rest of the country, and that they're smarter than everybody else, and they really don't sort of care for what ordinary people think, it goes back to this era. George McGovern, a very decent guy, but he was not somebody who by any stretch of the imagination would be appealing to kind of ordinary folks. His positions on all that stuff was way to the left or way off the end. And the outcome of this was that Nixon won in 1972, carrying 49 out of 50 states. This was the largest landslide in history. And for Nixon, it wasn't enough. He could have seen, this Nixon was very shrewd politically. He could do the vote counts. He knew he was going to win, but he seemed to want to get every state, all 50 states. For heaven's sakes, he got South Dakota. The only one he didn't get was Massachusetts. Yeah, some of you may remember when Watergate surrounded Nixon, there were the bumper stickers that said, "Don't blame me, I'm from Massachusetts." Okay, so anyway, I still cannot figure out what motivated Nixon to do this. Is there something in his childhood? Is there something about you can't just win big. You can't just win. You can't just win big. You have to win it all. I don't know this. And I will say that Nixon to me is a puzzle, an enigma, a personal enigma. Because Richard Nixon was smart. He had the soundest strategic sense of any American president, with the possible exception of Theodore Roosevelt, in understanding how the pieces of the international puzzle fit together, and how if you move this piece over there, then this piece will slide there, and to do this in a way that will improve American interests in the world. But why did he go into politics? That's what I can't figure out. Politics is usually the arena where people who like other people go, and people who are happy to stand on the corner when the shift is getting off at the factory and saying, "Hi, I'm Dick Nixon, I'd like your vote." Nixon was painful under small talk. Now, so here's a story about Nixon, and I hesitate to tell the story because the punchline has to be explained in advance. But some of you will remember Golda Meir, of her. So she was Prime Minister of Israel. She also happened to grow up in Milwaukee, but nonetheless she moved to Israel and became Prime Minister. And she had a foreign minister named Abba Eban. And if you are a crossword puzzle aficionado, you know that, because EBAN works really well, fits lots of things. But Abba Eban was educated at Oxford, and he spoke with an impeccable Oxbridge accent. He spoke English with an impeccable Oxbridge accent. So he was Foreign Minister of Israel. And America's Foreign Minister, which is to say America's Secretary of State, was Henry Kissinger. And if you have paid any attention to Kissinger's career, you will know that Kissinger speaks with a very thick German accent, even though he arrived in the United States from Germany at the age of 13. And he had an older brother who spoke English unaccented. But in his field, in the field of foreign policy, apparently if you have a German accent, it gives you greater gravitas. But anyway, so Nixon's standing there at a photo opportunity with Golda Meir. And he's saying, "Madam Prime Minister, we have something in common." And Golda Meir, okay, where's this going? He says, "Yes." And Nixon says, "We both have Jewish foreign ministers," which is not particularly unusual if you're from Israel. And Golda Meir says, "Yes, and mine speaks English." Anyway, so it's a puzzle to me what drove Nixon to do what he did. And I'm not going to relate the whole story of Watergate, but I hope I've made it at least plausible that Watergate is at the heart of what I consider to be the most important development in American history. Well, I'll go so far as to say in the last 80 years. And it is this, what I'm calling this great unraveling, or this big shift in American attitudes toward government. Watergate's a big part of it. Vietnam's part of it as well. But I should add that Watergate sort of came out of, as I say, the Vietnam issue because of the Pentagon Papers and all this. But there was this moment, there was this long moment, 50 years, from the early 1930s to, let's call it the mid-1970s, early 1970s anyway, when Americans were willing to accept a bigger government role because government was thought to be trustworthy, government was thought to be competent. And then when that faith in American trustworthiness, that is government's trustworthiness, and competence, then Americans changed their minds. And I'll bring it back to Gerald Ford and his role in all of this. There will be more on this in future installments. But Gerald Ford was the ideal person to succeed Richard Nixon as president in a very central way that I think touches on Gerald Ford's enduring contribution to our understanding of history and politics and the way it can work and the way it should work. Jerry Ford did not become president because he had that fire in the belly that drives most people to endure what they have to endure to become president. He didn't have this insatiable need to reach the top of that greasy pole. He was quite unlike Lyndon Johnson, for example, or Richard Nixon, who, in some very basic ways, they would have felt their lives were failures if they hadn't reached the top, if they hadn't achieved that acme of American political success. Jerry Ford was not like that at all. Jerry Ford seemed to be pretty comfortable in his own skin. He was a very solid citizen. He was a very solid member of Congress. He had been for several years the minority leader in the House of Representatives. His ambition, the height of what he hoped for in his political career, was to become Speaker of the House. But he understood that that depended on a lot besides himself, because the Republicans are going to have to win a majority in the House of Representatives, which they had not had for decades. And in fact, he was on the verge of retiring when Nixon when Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, had to resign because of a scandal actually unrelated to Watergate per se, but it got swept up into the whole thing. And so Nixon is looking for someone, the Republican Party is looking for someone whose honesty, devotion to the national interest cannot be questioned. And probably part of this, but also a part of the appeal is, and who doesn't have obvious ambitions to be the next president of the United States. Because it would be awkward to bring somebody on board if you're Richard Nixon, because, by the way, so Agnew is forced out at a time when Watergate is becoming uncovered. It takes a long time between the arrest of the burglars in June of '72 to the summer of '73 when the Senate Watergate hearings take place, and Nixon finally resigns in the summer of 1974. So it's this slow-moving scandal. And the last thing Nixon needs, and the last perception that he wants to convey, is that he's brought on board this guy who's going to help push him out. And so Gerald Ford took the job. It's an honor, but he certainly didn't expect it to lead to anything. He thought that this would be a nice sort of send-off. I'll do this and then retire in 1976 when this term is up, and that would be that. And Ford knew no more about Watergate than anybody else did. So he didn't know where this story was going. But when the story went the way it did, when Nixon, as became apparent, engaged in the cover-up of this, and it was at this time that the adage emerged that it's not the crime, it's the cover-up that's going to get you. And that's indeed the case. If Nixon had, if he had better public relations people, he had professional PR assistants. The first rule of PR is get it all out there. Throw everything you have out there, because otherwise it's going to dribble out, and every day you're going to be in the papers. If he had done that, there wouldn't have been any story. He would have lasted. Oh, but there's one other thing. There's one other thing, and this gets back to the biographical part. If you remember Watergate, you remember Iran-Contra. And viewed sort of objectively, and from the standpoint of America's position in the world, Iran-Contra was a bigger deal than Watergate, because Watergate was essentially a domestic affair. And the Republicans were trying to make it harder for the Democrats to get elected and fooling with their campaign and all this stuff. But Iran-Contra, this was the government of the United States proclaiming this one policy in public and then in secret doing this other thing and evading the law quite clearly at the same time. But there was never any strong desire to kick Ronald Reagan out, to impeach Ronald Reagan. Why was this so? And why did it happen to Nixon? Nixon resigned one step ahead of the impeachment posse. And so Nixon resigned. Why did it happen to Nixon and not to Reagan? And I would say the difference is people liked Reagan. And, that might sound trivial. We're talking about, great affairs of government. But when you live in a democracy, when you operate your politics on the principles of democracy, well, every election is, in essence, a popularity contest. Do people like you? And if they like you, they'll cut you some slack. They cut Reagan a lot of slack. And nobody was going to cut Nixon any slack because he wasn't likable. And it almost sounds like junior high. But that's the way things often work. I've often thought that the clearest gauge for, if you want to know who people are going to vote for, who's going to win an election, the question should be, who would you rather sit down and have a beer with? Candidate A or candidate B? And if candidate A gets the suds, that candidate's going to win. Because people want to feel that that person in the White House, if we're talking about the president, somehow knows me. And there has to be a kind of identification. Anyway, so Gerald Ford comes in, and Watergate happens all around him. And I'll get us to the end very quickly. I think I've gone over my half hour. But anyway, so Richard Nixon is told, the Supreme Court has said you have to turn over these very incriminating tapes. And Nixon then is informed by Republican leaders in Congress, you're going to be impeached and you're going to be convicted. So you better make a decision because that's going to happen if you don't do something. So Nixon resigns. Now, Nixon resigns, and one of the reasons he resigns, and one of the reasons that people are willing to accept the resignation, is that this new guy, Gerald Ford, he doesn't have a long and obvious paper trail, but there are no scandals in his background. There's no hint of any impropriety. He seems like the anti-Nixon, because Nixon now is seen as this purveyor of skullduggery and everything else, and Gerald Ford is this just straightforward guy from Western Michigan who does things the way they're supposed to be done. But then, a month after Nixon resigns, Gerald Ford pardons him. And all of a sudden, these questions are raised. Wait, was there a deal here? Did Nixon and Ford get together, or maybe through intermediaries? And did Ford say, Dick, if you resign, then as president, I'll pardon you. You're not going to have to go to jail, which by this time was a real possibility. Now, there's no evidence that anything like a deal occurred. And in fact, it strains the imagination to think that there would be anything explicit. However, it's entirely possible that Nixon reasoned the way that Ford subsequently reasoned, and that is, from a constitutional standpoint, the big deal is that this president is no longer president. Now let's move on. And that's, in fact, precisely the argument that Ford made in justifying the pardon. Now, the short-term consequence of this was relief in the country and a sense that, okay, yeah, we can move past Watergate. And so, in the short term, Jerry Ford's decision was good for the country. In the slightly longer term, it was bad for Jerry Ford because it meant that there was no way he was going to win in 1976. And in fact, even with the bad news about Richard Nixon, Ford could have been the favorite going to the election of 76 because if you look at the electoral map of 1972, the Republicans had this huge majority, and a lot of those states would still vote for a Republican, especially if the Republican's not Richard Nixon anymore. So it cost Jerry Ford a lot in the short term to make this decision. But I really don't get any sense that he agonized over it much. It was the right thing to do, and it might cost me the presidency, but I have never said that the presidency is my highest goal in politics. So he makes the decision and he abides by the outcome. Now, and I should say that for the next 45 years, a general belief in the public at large was it was probably a good idea. Ford's decision was right. But for reasons that you might very well appreciate, in the last 5 years or so, people have started to think, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. Because we are still in a confused state of mind about whether the President of the United States can be prosecuted. Is the President above the law or not? We've never tested it. And if there ever was going to be a clear test, that would have been the time. So whether Gerald Ford's decision to pardon Richard Nixon was good for the country seems a little bit less clear now than it did then. But there's an interesting thing that happened in that same intervening time. Well, the decision to pardon Nixon was bad for Jerry Ford in the short term. He loses the election of 1976. It, as much as anything else, has caused his reputation for integrity, for character, for putting the national interest ahead of personal interest, that has grown over the intervening time. And so what Jerry Ford is remembered for is the fact that he was, especially maybe to our jaded eyes today, kind of a model of the public servant who goes into politics for the right reasons, comports himself in the right and appropriate way, and is willing to abide by the decision of the people, even if it turns out adversely. So Gerald Ford, during the 1970s, was at the center of all this stuff going on. And I think he remains somebody who is very instructive for us today. And indeed, well, I'll put it this way, and this is probably an audience that might be more inclined toward Jerry Ford than other audiences. But if Jerry Ford were on the ticket in 2024, how many of you would vote for him? Okay, yeah, he'd be a breath of fresh air compared to most of what we can expect. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. And now we have time. Do we have time for questions? Okay. Questions, please.
Oh, I have one.
Yes, the question.
It's not a question.
Okay.
It's a comment. It's a couple comments.
Sure.
I want to enroll in your class with all your freshman students.
Okay, I'm going to tell you. If you can get to Austin, 10 o'clock on Monday or Wednesday morning, my door is open.
My second one is that I know you must realize how inspiring you are to these students because you make history vibrant, exciting, fun, factual, and not dry and boring.
Well, thank you for that comment. That's a very kind comment, but you haven't seen the full of it yet. Because I don't think in Grand Rapids I have done to the audiences here what I do to my students. I sing to my students. But obviously I'll have to save that for another time. Yes. Oh, we have a question back here. Yes.
Yes, this has to do with Jerry Ford's demise, how he lost the election. It's often been said that one of his problems was he wasn't his own man. He kept the Nixon cabinet in place. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, so there's a good reason why he kept the Nixon cabinet in place, because he wanted to make clear that this was not an inside coup. He was fully aware that nobody had elected him vice president, nobody had elected him president. So for him to come in and say, okay, I'm going to change things, he had no mandate to do that. It was very clear that Richard Nixon was the one who was about to be impeached, that Nixon was at the center of all of this, and Nixon's and Watergate scandal, it involved a couple members of the cabinet, but for the most part it was people who worked in the White House. So to keep the other members of the cabinet was entirely appropriate. But you're absolutely right. It did hurt his political chances because it allowed people who were not inclined to vote for him, or people who were on the fence, or people who, for example, thought that there was this deal, to say, well, he's just coming in and he's taking over Nixon's, taking his government. And if he would have been able to distance himself more from the previous administration by cleaning house. But it also would have made it simply that much harder to do the government's business. Because you can imagine that in the wake of Watergate, being a member of the cabinet was not a particularly appealing job offer. And so to bring new people in, when the government had been essentially paralyzed during most of this 2-year period from the summer of 72 to the summer of 74, it would have been a grave disservice to the country as a whole. And I don't want to make Gerald Ford out to be a saint, but I do think he had this, I think his natural inclination was to ask himself, so what's the best thing to do for the country? And I think he made a very plausible case to himself that the best thing to do is to maintain as much continuity as we can, having sort of got rid of the people who were going to go to jail. I should point out that Nixon didn't go to jail, but something like 4 dozen other members of the administration and people who worked for the administration did go to jail in the whole Watergate scandal. So it was this big deal. Other questions? There's a question. Yes?
How has the media coverage of the presidency changed in the last...
I'm glad you asked that question, because I didn't get a chance to say all the things that had changed during this 1970s period. And this is one aspect of the change, and it's a real sea change that is most directly connected to Watergate. So I don't know if any of you perhaps have had part of your life's work or career in journalism. But if you have, you will know that journalists before the 1970s were usually called reporters. And it was something that didn't require an advanced degree, and maybe you started out on the copy desk or something, and you learned how to ask the who, what, when, where, why questions. And you always learned to lead with the leading stuff, and then you wrote this pyramid style where the important stuff goes to the top and less so then cut it from the bottom. It wasn't a glamorous career. And who made it glamorous? Woodward and Bernstein. Because when everybody else was saying there's nothing to this Watergate story, they kept at it. They kept at it. And they finally, just uncovered that there was more involved. And then, of course, to get played by Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman, that makes it look pretty glamorous. Boy, if I go to journalism school, then I can be like Robert Redford or Dustin Hoffman. But it also, at a deeper, sort of more serious level, before the 1970s, I'm not going to say specifically before Watergate, although chronologically it works that way, but in the 1960s, reporting on politics in Washington was kind of a clubby, inside baseball affair. And reporters hung out with politicians. They went to the same cocktail receptions. They sent their kids to the same schools and all of this. And there was a tendency to think that what happens in Georgetown stays in Georgetown. There wasn't this desire to uncover the bad things that government is doing. Call it maybe a recognition that politicians are human too. Call it a willingness to respect a divide between public lives and private lives. Do you need to know who's having an affair to know how you should vote in the next election. And there are some some ill consequences to this. There's a lot of stuff that got swept under the rug. So it would have really been a public service if the public had known more about John Kennedy's health during his presidency and how he was on lots of painkillers, and he just, he could be on TV for a while and look good and look young and healthy, but he really wasn't. And that might have changed. That was something that would have been useful for voters to know. The reporters knew it. The folks who reported for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, others, they knew it, but they were not going to share that. When Woodward and Bernstein and other newspapers caught on, realized that they could bring down a presidency, this is heady stuff. Then people head off to journalism school, think, we aren't simply neutral reporters on what happens. We can have an influence on the outcome. And so journalism becomes a cause. And at least at first, it was often a cause for sort of progressive reform. But, and this is where the historian should hesitate to ascribe too much causation here, because while Watergate is going on, and in the half-decade after, the media landscape is changing dramatically. And the biggest change is the invention and distribution of cable television. Because in the days before cable TV, the government could and did enforce fairness, what they called fairness, equal treatment of both parties, both sides of an issue, on the three major broadcast networks. Because the government owned the airwaves, and there was limited bandwidth. But along comes cable TV, and the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, says we don't need the fairness doctrine anymore because everybody can have their own cable TV station. And so instead of 3, you can have 300. You can have 3,000. And as long as, if you're going to have a Fox News, then people who don't like that can create an MSNBC. And so, interestingly, from the historian's perspective, the United States, in its media landscape, goes from a relatively brief period of time, call it the age of television, really, from the early 50s to about the mid-1970s, where the media outlets were expected to be neutral reporters. But if you go back to the earliest days, in the 1790s, political parties created their own newspapers. And the newspapers were organs of the party. And newspapers in the 1800s, in the 19th century, they were almost always clearly identified with one party or the other, to the point of having Republican in the label, in the title, or Democrat in the title. It's only when you get in the 20th century, when you get in this situation of narrow bandwidth, that Walter Cronkite is supposed to be this one who plays it down the middle, and David Brinkley and so on. But then you get cable TV, and you split up again. So the media becomes partisan in the 1970s, 80s, and it does today. But it throws us back to the late 18th century and the 19th century. So this is something that's been around a while. But it definitely did change the landscape. And this idea that journalists, not just reporters, they're not called just reporters anymore, but journalists, they can be stars. And you can really tell the difference if the press conferences, they call them press conferences rather than media conferences or news conferences. The press conferences of Franklin Roosevelt were not televised. Television didn't exist yet. And they deliberately weren't broadcast on the radio. But you can read the transcripts of them, and it's really clear that reporters who covered the president and took part in the press conferences, this was much more a collegial approach. We're all trying to serve the public. And those of us in government are trying to serve it one way, and you in the media are trying to serve it another way. But there isn't this idea. You don't get reporters who are constantly asking gotcha questions. Have you stopped beating your wife yet? That sort of thing. But after Watergate, and any of you who have watched presidential news conferences, somebody like when Sam Donaldson's up there, and you can tell, whoever the president is, we're going to get you. We got you this. And so now, in the days before Watergate, Journalists didn't make any money. You know, reporters, they were as poorly paid as school teachers. But now, you know, reporters, if you're a media star, you get paid like a star. So that is, this is something that has followed after Watergate, and Watergate's partly responsible. I wouldn't say it's the whole thing. But it did change, the media landscape did change.
Let's give Bill Brands a hand.
Okay, thank you very much.